Hi, Jonathan Godfrey with Onsite Wastewater Professionals, and I have the absolute privilege today of being here with Steve Steinbeck, talking a little bit about the past, maybe the present, and thinking to the future of Onsite Wastewater. Steve, you were one of the leading figures in starting our Onsite Wastewater program in North Carolina. You retired from the state as the branch head of Onsite Wastewater, kind of not only led that program, but maybe even created or helped drive that program into the future. Is that possible?
Well, Jonathan, you're kind, but I was very fortunate. We had talked earlier in the green room about some of the background, so we're not going to get into that green room conversation. But I was hired to be the first employee that specialized in the on-site program for the state. The gentleman that hired me was Stacy Cole. He's deceased now, but he was probably one of the two best bosses I ever had. My other one was an old college professor named Dr. Fisher, who was a geotechnical engineer that was trained by Casagrande at Harvard, and I got a lot of good engineering soils background from him in geotechnical engineering before I came to work with the state. So I came from the private sector after about 5.5 years into the state of North Carolina, and back then it was the Department of Human Resources, and under that was several conglomerates of health-related, human resource-related programs, and that was the sanitary engineering section that was under the public health division, or the Division of Health Services. So you had the department, the division, and then the section. And under the sanitary engineering section, there was several branches, and Stacy Coble headed up what was called the sanitation branch. At that time, it included shellfish sanitation program, and then the classical environmental health program of sanitation in food service, institutions, schools, and on-site water and wastewater.
What year are we talking about? Give me an idea of
I began in the sanitation branch the fall of November of 1976.
Wow. I
had just had gallbladder surgery. I was hired flat on my back in Rex Hospital with the gallbladder surgery, and I accepted the job and told Stacy I had some projects I had to finish up before I could take it.
Okay.
So he hired me that summer, and I waited a couple months before I could start, because I had, as a consultant, I wanted to wrap up some projects I was working on at that time before I started.
Now that was a dynamic time, because I look back at a lot of my rules, and 77 is a key date. Mm-hmm. So a lot of things must have been happening around that time.
There were. A gentleman under Stacy Coble, there was an assistant branch head named Ed Rupert. Ed was a retired public health official, graduated from Johns Hopkins. Brilliant guy. And he was my mentor when I started. Ed was not a soil scientist. He was just a classic biological background, environmental health person, and great mentor to me. And he took me under his wing and taught me about public health. I didn't have a whole lot of understanding of public health. I knew soils, I knew rock, I knew water movement, stuff like that, but I didn't know anything about public health, except my brother had polio and we were quarantined.
Okay.
And that was one reason I got into that. I was interested because my brother got down the road here at Kennels Beach in Pamlico County. He and his friend got polio back in the early 50s. And they ended up here in the St. Luke's Hospital here in Newbern. I believe it's the old hospital. Both of them had polio. And then they got transferred eventually to Rex Hospital. My brother and Mark both recovered. In fact, my brother played football in high school and college. But we got polio then. It was a fecal oral transmission. So that always was in the back of my mind as from public health. Okay. And it was always close to my heart, because that was my first acquaintance with the health director came to our door in Cary, where I lived and grew up, and put a placard on our front door, literally. And we were quarantined for 2 months. 2 weeks, 2 weeks after my brother came home. So I already had that in the back of my mind, and I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was with J Technical Engineering Company out of the Research Triangle area, and was ready for a career move. And environment, and I always wanted to work in an environment area because I had done some groundwater studies that were pretty intense, and some landfill studies, and quite a bit of work related to health and environment, and I liked that. And then I was talking one day to a person in state government. He mentioned there was a job opening over in the sanitary engineering section, sanitation branch, looking for somebody to work in the septic tank program, I think they call it then. And I kind of rolled my eyes and I said, I'm not a big fan of state government programs, but I'll think about it. I did. And the retirement was good then.
Yeah.
And still is. And I did 3 interviews. I won't say who, but it was 3 different agencies. And when I interviewed with Stacy Cole, I was hooked. And he probably didn't work with Stacy Cole, but he was an institution in the sanitation branch, and a great inspiration to me. I started work in November of '76, and they brought me along slow. At that time, there were only 2 soil scientists working at the county level. There was Everett Lynn working in Wake County, who had previously started in Mecklenburg County and then moved to Wake County. And then there was a soil scientist in Mecklenburg County named Ed Cassavant. And Ed later went on to the state of Tennessee to work at their program. And both of them good soil scientists. And I did some work with them and got a feel for what some of the more advanced counties were doing. And at that time in '76, most counties were pouring a hole, digging a hole, and then pouring water in a hole and seeing what happened to it.
Fully into the perk test world. But everything was fragmented in the county structure. There was no overarching state structure on there?
There was. It's hard to believe there was a state law, GS 130-160 at that time. It basically said all counties have to have a set of rules.
Okay.
And that was about it.
Okay.
There was some guidance put out by the state agencies over the years. Give you an example. We had a bulletin on how to construct a proper privy. And there's an interesting story of how we got public health and privies that they linked together. A gentleman from Cary, North Carolina, named Walter Hines Page. If you've ever written a book by Page Doubleday,
yeah.
Well, he was the publisher he was the original publisher of that. Anyway, he's from Cary. He's the favorite son of Cary. He became, because he was in New York, he was friends with a gentleman by the name of the Rockefellers. The Rockefeller Foundation was very much into public health. This is at the turn of the century. This is the last century, early 1900s. And Walter Hines Page took this Rockefeller on a train trip across North Carolina, and the famous line out of that trip was, "God knows, there's a lot of sleepy people on these railroad tracks." It became known as the Rip Van Winkle State. Why would we get that name? Well, the research showed we had every parasite known to man in our bodies at that time in rural North Carolina. We had hookworm, ringworm, roundworm, everything, and it was just it was causing fatigue in young adults and old adults too. And where was it coming from? Poor sanitation, poop.
Yep.
And so the Rockefeller Foundation funded a program to start getting sanitary privies built across the state. Now, they didn't go out in subdivisions then. They went to the schools. They went to public schools, which is a lot of programs start in public schools, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm not going to get into politics of that today, but they went to the schools across the state because most of the schools were public schools at that time, and got sanitary privies built and shared plans with the kids. And they took them home, and then the kids said, well, let's build one of these too, because slot jars and putting it down on the back 40 was the way of life.
Yeah.
and all the parasites and the disease that went along with it. So that's how it got started, and then they funded the very first. That's why North Carolina is one of the oldest public health programs in the country, and Guilford County was the first county, and Robinson County was the first rural county to have a public health program. So that's how that started, and it was from a guy that was originally from Cary, which is kind of ironic.
It is, but it was absolutely not a cohesive unit when you started.
No,
it was all over the place.
It was. We had everything from let the builder or developer do the perk test and bring the numbers by and we'll check it, or we'll, after you dig it and put water in it, we'll go by and check it after a day or so.
You know, you hinted at this earlier in our conversations, but there was some move in North Carolina to make somebody want to hire somebody like you to want to focus resources and effort onto on-site wastewater. And trying to understand what the impetus was, what the driver of that was, it really, I think, would be fascinating for people to know. What drove people to want to bring you in and to kind of set the stage to create this kind of change in on-site wastewater?
I'll give you a one-word answer, and then there's a longer answer.
Okay,
you know,
I'll take them both.
You know, my old grandfather, who was a college professor at Salem College in West Virginia, he kept form at school. He said the thoughts of an old man are long, long thoughts. So I apologize for being long-winded, but in one word, it was shellfish.
Okay.
All right, and it came out of a movement in the early 70s that the coastal area we were a big oyster industry back in up till the early 70s, and the coast was really developing in aggressive manners in the 70s, and they were seeing a direct relationship to closure of shellfish waters, and there were some ladies in the coastal, lower coastal zone, in the lower coastal plain along the coast, that some of them were oyster women, and they got very active. Some were in the Surf City area, some were in Brunswick County, but the Surf City area where it became hot in Topsail Beach area. Marshall Staten had to go down there and make a presentation, and he got beat to death at a town hall meeting there at the town hall, and they made a promise. We're going to improve. So at that time, trying to think who the governor was. Phil Kirk was the secretary. Oh, I know. Phil Kirk was the secretary of DHR, and Mr. H. Jim Harrington was the secretary of what we now know as Environmental Management or Department of Environment and Natural Resources, I guess it is. But Mr. H was from Cary at that time. And they got their heads together and said, well, we'll get our two commissions to do a better job.
Okay.
And there had been a law adopted in 1973 called the Ground Absorption Act of 1973 that gave what came about at that same time, and basically charged both commissions, Commission for Environmental Management and the Public Health Commission, to come up with a plan to regulate the large and small septic tank systems, ground absorption systems as they were called. And so from that, they started looking around and says, well, we don't have anybody in the program that knows anything about soil, rock, water, anything. And so they advertised, and it took them a couple of years to find the right person, I guess, or get somebody to apply. And I was foolish enough to come there at the last minute and applied, and they were getting desperate, so they hired me.
There you go.
So I started in November of '76. There had been a rule drafted up. Again, I referred to Ed Rupert, and he had worked with some folks over at NC State and Soils Extension, Joe Phillips, Louis All, and then Bobby Carlisle. To some degree, their technician Dennis Osborne were involved in working with Ed in getting some improved directives to the counties. The directive from the statute was, you will develop soil-based rules. You will get away from just perk tests. It was implied anyway. you'll get science behind it.
And we're still in the 70s, or we
still
in
the early 70s,
Okay.
going into the 74, 75, 76 era. So they had put together a draft, and it was a good first start. It started. They dug the foundation. It
Okay.
hadn't been poured yet, but they dug the foundation. It was ready to be synthesized a little bit, but they had it was called a technical guide at that time. And so that's when I came in, and they adopted the rule, and then the technical guide went along with it, and it was very controversial. The Home Builders Association brought busloads of people to Raleigh for that commission meeting, and they delayed it a year till July 1 of 76 to put in some grandfather clauses. The big hang-up was setback distances from shellfish waters, because it was a 100-foot setback,
Right.
and a lot of those lots were 50 foot wide, so it was impossible if you were on the water to develop your property, because it was only 50 by 50 if you're lucky. 50 by 100, you didn't have any place to put it. So they had to come up with a set of grandfather clauses, if you will, and that's how that rule is called the July 1, 77 rule is still there, because of the compromise that was put in place.
Okay.
And Bob Riley, who was at the AG's office at that time, who was a phenomenal resource to me over the years, and his legal advice when I was going through some things in the future that we'll get into. But Bob Riley was the one that came up with the language for that, and it's still there.
Stood the test of time.
It did.
Very good. So we're seeing the formation of rules. We're in that 70s period, and if we step ahead a little bit, you're forging rules out of nothing. So it's not like there was a good foundation to work off of. You're creating something from scratch, right? Which most people in government don't have the opportunity to do. It's a unique place where you actually got to create and move things forward. So we move forward, but we're still in perk test until when?
Well, that was phased in.
Okay.
And we did not change the program overnight. And I knew that going in.
Okay.
I knew the personalities were not going to change. Some of these people have been around more years than I had been alive, so you're not going to change people overnight, and I accepted that. I just went out. My goal was to, as a one person covering the whole state, working through our district sanitarians at that time. We kind of cross-trained them in on-site, but the district sanitarians, they were principally working in food and lodging institution type things. But I worked through them. They were kind of the first guy, the first line of defense, and then they'd call me. So it was a joke for a couple of years. Who the health director at that time was Ron Levine. Well, later, but anyway, we were in a race. Who's going to get to the 100 counties first? And he beat me by about a month. But I had worked over the years. I'd worked in all 100 counties. So from 1976 to 82, I was it. There was no other person. But in that interim, I had
There was no other regional soil scientist.
No.
Okay.
No.
Steve Steinbeck, soil scientist.
I was the only person going around, and there was a health director that was brought in. I won't name him because he got a little controversial, but he had gone out in the field and said at this big meeting of the whole public health division at that time in the highway building auditorium, he said, there's one guy sitting back here in the back, and I've got to clone him. That's Steve Steinbeck. And I was embarrassed, of course. But he gave the impetus to get some staff and to rewrite some laws and then rewrite the statutes. So that was in the early 80s.
And there was another rewrite around the 82, 83 period, because we get other grandfathering dates that happen right around there. Things that obviously the takeaway here is, and I think there's wisdom in the idea that you're not going to make change overnight, that big change. And had you tried to just beat your head against the wall, I guess you might not have had as good of results.
I've thought back. You get old and you think back to those things and say, how in the heck did we do that? I mean, what did work? I just tried to lead by example.
Okay.
If it took working by the headlights of a car after dark, I did it. If it took working till 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon in Asheville. I did it, and I was one of the few that ever did that, because they said usually if you from out of the county or out of Raleigh,
Right.
you guys leave at lunch. I said no, I got it's a job to do. So I didn't punch a clock. I didn't know how much money I made. I just gave him a check to Elaine, and I didn't worry about a clock.
Well, that works out. You said 52 years of marriage, right?
That's right. 52.
There we go. Early victories. Like, how, did you have anything that you think back on now, and you said that gave me reassurance that my efforts were not wasted, that I was on the right track, that we were making a difference? Do you recall any big wins early on?
Oh, there's many. And I did, of course, we did a lot of training. We did a lot of regional meetings. We did started doing a lot of workshops. I did with the great help from extension staff over at NC State, Bobby Carlisle, Louis All, Joe Phillips. I'm missing out, I'm just losing some fellas, but what was another guy from Kerry? Anyway, they helped us, and we put on a lot of good workshops all over the state. Did them constantly. Every quarter we were doing workshops.
Who was your audience for those workshops? Were they
always county? Always county.
Your regulators, your county sanitarians?
We were trying to get our folks trained first.
Okay.
We were trying to focus on our folks, and we'd go to regional education meetings, and of course that was an interesting audience, because some would just sit in the background and guffaw, and others were on the edge of their seats. And some victories, I'll give you a few. Of course, Wake County, Mecklenburg County. Orange County was a shining star. Orange County had been part of a district health department, very large district. It used to be PPCC. It was Chatham, Orange. I can't remember if Lee was in there or not. Lee was in there.
They were in a district.
Person and Castle. And they pulled out July 1 of 1977. That happened to be the key date when the new rules went into effect. They finally got adopted and went into effect that date. And they changed their program on that date. Tony Laws was the head of environmental health at that time, and Tony would change. And they had some good people on staff, and they did. I had an opportunity to get a grant to do a septic study. That was a new word that was coined back then, and nobody knew what septic was. And we said, we're going to teach you what septic is. And I got a grant from solid waste folks to do a study. And I hired Frank Olive, who had been a supervisor in New Hanover County, and the first female supervisor in environmental health in North Carolina, Sue Grayson. I hired her to head up this program to study septic, with the goal of coming out with revisions to statutes and rules, and a set of rules that then we could decide what to do with the septic program. Now, that's an interesting little story about that. But anyway, as part of that survey, I had a chance, we had a beautiful program in public health called statistics, and it had some brilliant statisticians over there. And there was a group over at NC State University. There was a guy that we partied together some in the Sunday school class, and John Stahl, and his boss was Jim Goodnight. And he said, well, I can work with you, and I'm working with the health statistics folks right now on a program we've developed over here in bio and ag engineering. And I said, yeah, well, can you find out if there's an interviewer doing fake? He said, yeah, we think we can. I'll tell you later who that is, but it's Kerry's biggest employer, is SAS Institute.
Yeah, we know him well in Chatham County. He's going to reshape our development work.
He'll do it right, though. He'll do it right. He's got development here and in Beaufort County. Not Beaufort, down in Beaufort, North Carolina. But anyway, they've done good work. But anyway, we were able to do a statistical survey of 1,880 systems in Orange County. And we went through a training period at how to do this survey, and we field tested the form. So we did this survey, and then my main question was this: okay, it's been 3 years of implementation since July 1, 1977 in Orange County. What's the failure rate versus the 3 years previous to that? So we did a kind of an apples and apples
Right.
comparison as close as you can, and it was pretty randomized. It was a big enough sample that it was pretty valid. So R was about 0.9, something like that. So
Okay.
it's pretty good. It was a direct correlation. If they followed the science of soils and soil morphology in predicting the performance of a septic system in that soil, it was a pretty good chance it was going to work. And we found out some other things too. There's a direct relationship between repairs and level of education. There's a direct relationship between poverty and system performance. There's a direct relation between teenagers and a household and failure. So there's several things that came out of that study.
They may still have some truth to that study.
But that study's published. Hopefully it's still around the agency somewhere. It was called the North Carolina Septic Study. That became famous, and EPA used it, and it went national. But that was a study we did, and then there was some others I can get into.
Kind of fortunate that that study took place in Orange County, where you think it could have happened in a county where you had almost universally good soils, where it wouldn't have really told the story of the value of using science to do this work. But Orange County, certainly, there's good and bad there.
Well, I relied on my research that I had done at the college level. And I love to do research. I just didn't want my laying down at the very bottom after doing all the hard work. And that was another story. But anyway, at the same time, I had another study going on with Dr. Carlisle at NC State and Dr. Mark Sobsey at Chapel Hill School of Public Health, a renowned virologist. They worked a lot with shellfish. And then Bobby, we called him Rattlesnake, decided to go back to Texas, to Texas A&M. He was an Aggie and went back there to teach and work on the farm. And so Craig Cogger moved up and took it over, and Craig was one of the most valuable researchers I've ever worked with. Craig headed up that program for the fate and movement studies that became famous and published, that we published. All this is in the early 80s now. There's a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
I'm loving it. Man, I told Stacy Coble, I said, can I work on a percentage? Because I'm doing good at this grant stuff. I'll just take a 10% cut off the grants. But we had to do some creative things to get those grants to keep the overhead down. But anyway, we were very fortunate we had at NC State and School of Public Health in Chapel Hill. I hate to say the other words, but Public Health School in Chapel Hill, that's enough. We were very fortunate to have them nearby and very interested and willing to look at what we felt were the worst case scenarios of what is the impact of on-site wastewater where you have poor soils and high water table. So we focused on test site, real systems out in the field and the coastal plains from Hyde County all the way down to Brunswick County.
Okay.
I forgot the exact number, but there was a number of systems. And there's a story behind each one of those too. But out of that study, it became pretty apparent that 50 foot was a pretty good number. 100 foot was better, of course. That's the old public health rule times two, you know. But 50 foot was pretty good, and 100 foot was very good. And then on the virology side, it was very eye-opening, because Mark Sopsey and Jim Scandora, who was his lead on that in the field, used a bovine virus that they had tagged and developed in the lab, so it was a safe virus. And during the wintertime, those little boogers travel. They survived a long time in saturated conditions, and they went right to shellfish waters. Mm. So that was the counterbalance to the nutrient movement of phosphates and the phosphorus and the nitrates and all that good stuff. So we're right back to the 100 foot again. So that was eye-opening, and out of that came a rewrite. Well, let me back up. Stacy Cole came to my office, and we were doing an annual review that we always did, and he said, Steve, this is late 70s, early 80s, he said, I want you to sit down and make 5 goals. And I've done this to my staff later. Give me 5 goals that you want to accomplish in the next 5 years. Number 1 was to rewrite the damn laws. I'm sorry, but they were a good start, but we need to improve them. They didn't have anything about management, surveillance, operation, maintenance. It was just get a permit. It was all about permits. And we needed to improve the permit system. And then we needed to obviously enhance the rules and get more science into it. And then we needed to intensify training. And then we needed staff. So come 82, we were able, and this was one of the career changing moments for me. I was able to sit down with Bob Riley and give him my list of statutory changes that he and I worked on a draft that became the 82 statute. And that was a very rewarding self-gratification type thing. So you can sit down and really affect policy. I knew we had our jobs cut out for us because in there we classify systems, and then we've got to operate and maintain those systems. And boy, that was a battle, but that's another day. But and at the same time, we brought in a committee, and Stacy and I met one Sunday afternoon to go over that. It's called the 838 Committee. And you know the old story, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That's how we set that committee up, being very candid. We brought in adversaries and proponents. And we sat in that conference room, about 20 of us on it. It was a big committee, it was too big. So I broke it up in subcommittees and made us task assignments. And each subcommittee had a task or part of a program rule rewrite to come back to the committee with. And then we deliberated. It took us about 2 years, and we came back with what became the rules of 82 and 83.
Okay.
And they're pretty much still in place.
Oh yeah.
Surprisingly.
Even a lot of carryover even into our new 18E rules now.
I haven't sat down and read them yet.
Yeah,
got them on the to-read list.
There's quite a bit. So we're in the 80s. We are pushing through the PERC test era and trying to give science its rightful place. And it sounds like you were at the tip of the spear on helping people understand that science matters in this thing. It's not digging a hole. It's not just getting it out of sight, out of mind. A lot of your career is defined by making sure that science had its due place in this. You talk a little bit about the importance. I mean, you're involved in getting grants at the state. Were there other areas where you kind of saw science win victories on this? Because you had, let's see, I mean, you brought other technologies to North Carolina that we'll talk about, but I just a little struck by the idea that it would have been easier to just let things rest or to just let people have their traditions than to force change with science.
That was never my personality. To explain that part, I need to go back to an old football coach of mine. And his philosophy was be better than the best. And we were. We won 4 straight championships. Never won the state, but we won conference championships every year. So that was my philosophy for my whole life. Always strive to be better than the best. Being first loser is not fun. I want to be first. And I wanted to build the best program in the country. And I had studied every program in the country. I knew what all 50 states, including
Who was the shining star of other states when you looked at that? Were there states that stood out as
a few? There was work being done then in Cincinnati and West Virginia was looking at treatment plants and options there. That was an EPA study. And then there was Oregon area was doing some stuff. They had some of the very early statewide conferences.
Okay.
That I picked up on. I started the on-site conference in '82, and it's been going on ever since. And I'm still
going.
Got my T-shirt on.
There you
go. So that was. I mentioned there was 5 things on the list. The other thing was the on-site conference. I wanted to do an annual. So in '82, things were wrapping up. I was busy. We were rewriting the statutes. We got rules underway. We were having some grant work that was wrapping up in both septic and fatal movement studies from septic systems and low pressure systems too. and I needed some help. So, I finally got, I think Levine was back in place again. So anyway, I got funding for 3 positions. Oh, the jurisdiction statute changed too. We inherited some of the systems from what's now DEQ.
DEM were the old ones. Yeah.
DEM was the old, and they had the systems over 3,000 gallons, and we had everything under 3,000 gallons. And that's a funny story how that came about. Marshall State, who was head of the sanitary engineering section then in our shop, met with his counterpart, Mr. Knight, over in environmental management.
Okay.
And they said, how are we going to divvy this up? Because the directive was, your agency take the big ones, and the health department take the small systems.
Had to figure out where to draw a line.
So where do you draw a line? So Mr. Steinbeck got on the phone and called the biggest tank manufacturer in the state at that time. Just ignore that. It's 5 o'clock. It's time to get a beer. But anyway, they called George Gasperson over at State Right Tank Company in Raleigh. They're out Gresham's Lake Road now. One of the big manufacturers. And he said, George, what's the biggest tank you make? 3,000 gallons. He said, there it is. That was the answer. That's how we got 3,000. Anyway, that went away in that statute change in the early 80s. So then we needed an engineer on staff. So, and they gave me option to hire 2 soil scientists to work east and west, and I'd still take some piddle in the middle.
Okay.
And then an engineer. Well, I was very lucky because Bob Rubin had been hired under another project, and I didn't even get into that, and I forgot about it. The Triangle J Council of Government did a phenomenal study. It was the lead agency in North Carolina, and later the EPA for the country, in regional planning for wastewater. They had wrapped up under Dave Reynolds' leadership, who's an old college classmate of mine, planning for sewers. Several of the counties in the Triangle J Council of Governments, that's mainly the Triangle counties, Durham, Chatham, Wake, Lee, I can't name them all. Anyway, the 7 counties. Said, we've got a plan for some non-point source pollution problems. And septic tanks kept coming up over and over and over. What are we going to do in northern Wake County? You know, that's our watershed for Raleigh and at that time Cary too. What are we going to do in the northern Wake area? So Dave Reynolds, who I mentioned was a classmate of mine, he and I were at a pig picking. And we're just, Dave, how you doing? Type meeting. And he said, Steve, I just finished a project with EPA about planning for public sewer, and you're the man over there I hear at Public Health. We need to meet. So we sat down and met over lunch in the Research Triangle Park area. And Dave and he had graduated a year after me. And we picked right up where we left off, had a good time. And he said, Dave was a brilliant grant writer, brilliant. And he wrote a grant for EPA to do the Triangle J wastewater study. And you probably heard about that. But it came out of, there's 6 publications, A, B, C, D, E, and F came out of that project. And I was involved in it from day one. And I helped Dave draft that research grant up. And that was a phenomenal study. I mean, again, just luck. It's just people falling in place, right, and things happen. It was serendipity so many times over. How I got the job, how I knew some people, and how we got things going. But anyway, it's out of that study came several things that we needed. We needed a 2-compartment tank. Simple thing. Well, that was a little controversial. I had a good friend of mine who worked over in DEQ at that time, was from Elizabethtown, and a friend of my wife who's from Elizabethtown. And he had words. He cussed me out and hung up on me. And he was head of the non-point source program over at DEQ. And a nice guy. We're friends today on Facebook. But his dad manufactured septic tanks. And it was going to put him out of business because he couldn't afford new forms. But what people didn't realize, Louis Moret, who invented they had the original patent on the septic tank. It's 2 compartments. It's 2 compartments for a good reason. And the research was clear from Cincinnati and everything else. And that was just one change.
Did it go to to 1 compartment just out of a logistics? It was just easier to pour, maybe?
It was easier to manufacture.
Okay.
That was the whole reason. Nobody wanted a 2 compartment tank. Well, I fought that battle, and that was a tough one. And I lost some friends over that too. But it's proven it was worth everything we put in to get that change. Just a simple change,
And once again, letting science lead where we need to go.
We're following the research.
Yeah.
And again, I've heard so many times, scientists make poor politicians, and they're exactly right. I was not a good politician, but I could get along with most people and had the respect, I think, of the committees that I had to work with over in the House and Senate. And I got to know all the governors very good, very well, and I respected them, and I think I got respect from them. And I had a reputation of no nonsense.
So we almost got there. You got to hire somebody in the East and somebody in the West.
Yeah.
And you got to hire an engineer for the state.
Yeah, those were good times. That was.
Who did you hire as an engineer?
That was a tough one because I had some applicants, but very few were qualified. I had electrical engineers, nuclear engineers, a few mechanicals, eggs. But nobody had real good background in on-site or small waste flows, and that's what I was looking for. A few years earlier, I had met this guy working up at Western Carolina University and working part-time, scratching out a living. He was just a character. But Bobby Carlisle from NC State and I had gone up there to do some workshops for this guy at Western Carolina. And he was working at that time at the Center for Improving Mountain Living. I thought that was pretty catchy. So we did a series of workshops, and I got to know this guy pretty well. And he got my respect. He was a little feisty and a little wary, and it's high energy, and I like that. And a thinker. He would stay over in our motel room till late at night, picking our brains and asking us questions and learning. And I got to understand that this guy's got a little bit of genius in him. And that was Stephen Berkowitz, and I recruited him. He did not apply, I recruited him. I'll admit it. And I will probably say that he was a good hire.
Absolutely.
He was the right person at the right time. Cost me some gray hair, but anyway, I love the guy and will to the day I'm not here. But he helped make that part of the program, and he gave it the energy it needed.
You talk about, we started out talking about pit privies, and the Rockefellers improving living conditions in the South and internal parasites, but Stephen and you had a big, ownership in bringing ideas to North Carolina. A strong understanding and application of low pressure pipe systems came into North Carolina, and some of the research over at NC State, I think, as well. But implementing that, and then from that understanding of low pressure pipe systems, pressure manifolds. And Stephen fully admits that ideas from you and conversations.
I can tell you 2 stories about that. Number one, Bobby Carlisle was at NC State. He lived in Cary, about 2 blocks away from me, so we became very good friends. And I cried the day he left North Carolina and went back to A&M. But Bobby was just a good field engineer. His background was civil engineering, and he worked in Ag Soils Extension at State. And we rode together many a time and did a lot of workshops together. And Bobby and I had studied some of the folks up in Wisconsin, what they were doing with low pressure mams. We didn't like their theory, but we liked the mechanics of what they were doing. Right. And again, going back to the Triangle J Council of Government project, that's how Bobby got a lot of funding, and Bob Huber got hired to do some work under that particular study that Dave Reynolds implemented and funded to NC State to do the alternative portion of that study, which was extremely important. We looked at all types of trench configurations. By the way, the V-ditch is still the best ditch. Period. It has the most absorptive surface surface area, and nobody does the V-ditch.
There's a V ditch in Chatham County. We saw it on repair. It had cinders in the ditch, and I wondered, what in the world am I looking at?
The V-ditch was the best trench. It still is. But we looked at every trench configuration. We looked at various media for sand filters. The first field demo test site was developed under that program at the Lick Creek Treatment Plant in Durham County. It was not in Chatham County. That was not the first one. The first one was in Durham County under the Triangle J Council of Government study.
Okay.
Let's get that straight now. I got to give credit, and Craig Cotter was the one that took that lead on that.
Okay.
Like, when he left and went to the left coast, that was a sad day too, because he was my co-chair of the original Onsite Wastewater Conference for North Carolina when it started in '82. What was the first year? I forgot. '82, '83. And we had proceedings from that conference too, by the way. I had a great secretary that loved to do proceedings. Anyway, I'm rambling a lot, but trying to tie it all together. So we had the Triangle J Council of Government Studies, task A, B, C, D, and F, E, and F. We had the Institute of Government involved in the legal end of it. We were looking at stuff that was going on with EPA, the Cincinnati studies, and the Wisconsin studies. They were working on a manual for on-site wastewater management. And so I was staying up with that because they were kind of the lead. You asked about who's the national lead. They were kind of the national lead. And I really liked what they were doing. Everybody said, well, why don't we do what other states? I said, no, we want to be better than the best.
Good.
If you do that, you're not going to be the best. So let's just pull all the science together. So Bobby and I, this is an interesting story. What county was it? I'll think of it in a minute. We were in Montgomery County. And there was some of that bedded argillite, thin soils, and Louis All, who was a soil scientist, premier soil scientist at NC State, and Bobby Carlisle, Jack Knight, district guy, and myself. Jack Knight was the district sanitarian. Went to Montgomery County and looked at this profile through pits. And Louis looked at Bobby and I and said, you know what? That low pressure system that they're talking about in Wisconsin, that would be perfect to inject that low pressure right in this profile right here. Draw, making a point in that profile where to go. We all said, yeah, that's a good idea. So that's how that started. The low pressure pipe came out of a comment. And we were familiar with the pressure mounds and that engineering part of it. And I want to tell you how we got the idea for a turnup. That was mine. I'll take credit for that. Turnup, not the vegetable, the turnup on the end of the line, because we had to maintain them. We learned real quick the distal end of those low pressure pipe systems get the solids.
Well, I did some work in Florida, and I found out then you're the reason we had problems with LPP, because Florida had no problems with LPP. Because if you don't put turnups and you never manage it, you never know there's a problem. Did you know that?
Yeah, they never check them. Never check the pressure. That's true. That's like they just look for a parent water table before they make a decision.
We're generalizing, but so you've got this foundational knowledge about low pressure, and that drives the thought that maybe there's other innovations with pressure manifold where we could utilize some of that pressure.
Let me jump in there and tell you how that came about. Elaine's uncle, my wife's uncle, was a brilliant mechanical person. He was he was a sewing machine repairman originally, and then he got his license and credentials to operate wastewater plants in the city of Greensboro. And he said, Steve, you work in wastewater. Let me take you down to my shop at the plant there in Greensboro, one of the plants. And he said, I'll show you what I'm working on. And I looked, he was in his shop, and he had his drill press all set up and had some gray pipes set up. I said, what's that? He said, that's Schedule 80. I said, oh, okay. Schedule 80 people? Yes. I didn't even know what Schedule 80 was. 40 was the only thing I knew. He said, well, I'm trying to develop a pressure manifold. I said, oh, okay. For sand filter? Yeah, to go over a sand filter for changing this water treatment plant here a little bit. We're getting poor distribution. I want to see if I can put some orifices in this pipe and make it all work mechanically. And I said, you just gave me an idea. So that Monday I came back and I had a blackboard in my office at that time. I said, we were in the bath building. I said, Steven, come here. I gotta share this with you. You know, you and I talked about the problem of high grease and oil on low pressure systems. I may have an option for you. I said, now you're the engineer, I'm going to give you the idea and you run with it. But this is what my idea is. We'll pump the sewage, the effluent, however pre-treatment's gone through, into a manifold, a 4-inch manifold. So you schedule 80, so you can drill and tap that. You put a thread on schedule 80, you can't do it on 40. And drill and tap it and come off with these laterals, small laterals, for a short distance. That's all you need, and then you can go back to gravity. So we'll get uniform distribution to each lateral, and then you go back to conventional. Right. So we get enhanced distribution, which is one of the goals, and then we'll get uniform distribution throughout, and
without the clog potential.
The clog potential. So that's how that came about.
It's pretty neat. But you know, you guys are
just stealing ideas from people.
Well, you're creating and you're bringing new concepts. Just like you said, it's not easy to change people's mind overnight. Steve, you go from there, and then you go and bring technology like drip irrigation into North Carolina.
That's a good story.
And so, like there didn't seem to be any reluctance to bring innovation, or like, was that a little bit scary to bring drip into North, or to think about that in North Carolina?
No, I was very comfortable with drip. It's an interesting story how that came about. I'm a big believer in drip. I like drip a lot.
Right. My regulatory past is Chatham County, so drip was part of what we do.
That's good. But you remember that group I told you I formed back in 84, 83, the Southeastern Coastal Program Managers Group? We met in Georgia, and they, when the host state has us, then they take the lead on putting the program together. Well, they had this company that was doing some drip irrigation, and they were using the Netafim pipe with the pressure compensated emitters. And Stephen and I went, and I think that was it from the state of North Carolina. And Steve and I both liked that concept. And it had the disc, second disc, I call them filters.
Right.
And it was some interesting technology. And I knew we had a potential for this, particularly in the very shallow soils, and particularly in the lower coastal plain. It would be a natural area. And we came back, and I talked to Mike Hoover about it, and then Bob Rubin, because Bob was interested a lot, and Bob really picked up on it. Out of that, we were able to go to Israel and see what they were doing there, because that's where the pipe was manufactured, and that's where the research had been done. And we did a tech transfer over the technology transfer trip for about a week, actually 8 days, and came back, and that's the rest is history. From North Carolina, we had Bob Rubin, myself, and Stephen Berkowitz. And we came back, and Stephen, to his credit, using very archaic IBM computers, developed the original backwash program. And it used to run all weekend before it would come out with an answer. And now you can do it in probably the same program, he can do it in 3 minutes or 30 seconds. But we knew we had problems, and we're not going to stop developing North Carolina. No. And that was not the goal. Hell, that's how we got money for Bobby Carlisle's position and some of those guys over at Extension, and to get research there, because Joe Phillips and myself and Stacy Cover went to the legislature and said, the way that our rules are written, the best ag soil is going to be the best soil for development.
That's a threat.
And it was a fact.
Yeah.
And I said, we need to solve that, we need to put some money into the bio and ag engineering at state to look at this issue and to help us with some alternatives. So that's how we got those positions funded and refunded and money in. So I guess that's the politics of it. Yeah. But we knew that there was some challenges on the coast, challenges in the mountains, and always challenges in the Piedmont because of the high growth. And the watershed competition we had.
So we've got this arc where we start with nothing. We create, You build a program, you put key people in place, you had some fortunate events with the right people at the right time, with high energy. We create a framework in North Carolina, you embrace new technology, and now we find ourselves today, we're on the cusp of a major rule change, right? And we've got to get out, and that same thing again, we've got to get out and educate and share this information to get everybody on board. Looking with your past in mind and your knowledge, the challenges that we're facing right now. Some of them are the same challenges, but some of them are a little bit scary. I believe strongly in on-site wastewater systems. Think as you do as a really good option to be a permanent solution for wastewater in certain areas of the state. But I look to the coast and some of the challenges they're facing with water, some of the same things that were the hook originally, right? Shellfish,
sanitation,
water quality down at the coast. And I look down at the legislation that recently passed in Florida. We got some big challenges facing our industry going forward. Do you have, is there anything that you think going forward that we need to really focus on, or what can we do with a future perspective to make a difference in this and to do the right thing? So,
well, as you know, and our new audience knows, there's a big push to privatization, and I understand that, and I have some respect for that. But it's only as good as the consultants are trained. The consultants, for example, you go to be a civil engineer from NC State, you don't study on-site wastewater. No. You're lucky if you get a day in it or a half a day, or read an article about it. And so there's no formal training at the college level. So we've got to fill that gap. And the designers are important. They're important for continued good development in North Carolina. And that group has got to be very well trained and self-regulated. All it takes is one bad consultant to run it. And I've seen that happen in other states. It hasn't happened that much in this state, but I've seen it happen in other states. And I've been to a lot of states doing conferences and workshops over the years. That would be number one. Make sure the private consultants are on top of the technology, the science, and the true engineering. It's not all engineering, and it's not all soil science. It's not all geology. It's a combination. It's a unique field.
It is,
because it's waste management.
It's absolutely inadequate if you've got superior knowledge, but that knowledge doesn't extend to the field. And it's absolutely inadequate if your field knowledge doesn't translate to the design world. You've got to be a unique character to do this job well. Somebody that can blend that field work with that understanding of the regulation and the design.
And that was where my background came from. I was familiar with the soils and geology of North Carolina. I'll give you this anecdotal story. I hired part-time a draftsman during the summertime. He's a school teacher, a neighbor of mine, and he did some summer work, so I hired him to be a draftsman. That's back when we actually had draft. And I'd give him my sketches and schematics and soil profiles, rock profiles, and he pretty them up for me. And he was very talented. And he became a full-time employee. And he said, "Steve, you know soil and all that. We're looking at buying a house over in Durham." And he lived in Marshall at that time. And he said, "Go out there and look at this." So I took a soil order, and we bought some of the early Arts Machine Shop augers from St. Louis, Missouri, or wherever it was. The solid bucket. They had the mud buckets then. That was in the early 70s. So I know what I
don't know if that was the best choice for Durham County.
I still got a bad wrist from that. Anyway, Durham County was one of those perk test counties. And Neil's lot was right in the middle of the Triassic Basin. As soon as I poked about 6 inches down below the topsoil, I said, "Oh my God, Neil, you don't live here." It's a nice looking subdivision. It's nice homes. I said, "Neil, you don't. You really?" He said, "Well, that's a good price." And this is 1972. The baby boomers had screwed up the real estate market, like we screwed everything else up. And long story short, he buys the house. So he says, can you come home? I'll feed you lunch. I said, okay. He takes me out and look. I said, oh my God. That was sewage running everywhere. And he had a well. Well was at best probably doing a gallon a minute, at best. It was pitiful. I mean, we pumped the well down, and I said, God, you're not getting any recharge on this. I mean, he was in the worst. It was siltstone, claystone, mudstone. You couldn't get any worse than that. There was not even arcosic sandstone there. And his septic system was running all over the place. I said, Neil, I told you don't buy this. He said, well, it passed the perk test. I said, our research that we worked, that I read about at NC State, said it's statistically invalid. You'd have to run, on this site, you'd probably have to run 20 perk tests to have something that's predictable. I said, it's a totally invalid test. That's why a geotechnical engineering company, who I worked for at that time, refused to do it. We did
Really?
any other kind of soil test you could think of, including Edinburgh limits,
Yep.
but we did not do perk tests. And that's what got me thinking. I said, God, these guys are screwed up. They're doing perk tests. That's so unscientific. But anyway, that's a little backstory on all that.
That's fascinating stuff. Stephen, I think it's awesome. You have been, by any measure, a transformative figure in onsite wastewater. You were kind of there at the beginning, and you pushed North Carolina through a lot of changes and put us in a leadership position. I go to conferences out of state, and North Carolina is, I asked you who the states were that are looked on as leaders. North Carolina is looked on as a leader in this, and I have to think it's because of leadership from people like you that kind of created that pathway to build something good here in North Carolina. I want to continue that, but I appreciate you taking time today to sit down and talk to us, share a little bit about the history of it. Really fascinating stuff. I'm afraid if we don't talk to people and get this information and share it with younger generations, we're going to lose it.
So. I think it's a real. If you don't know what your history is and you respect your history, you're going to repeat it, and that's not good.
No, I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to the perk test day. So, thank you very much for taking a minute today to talk to us.